All right, we just finished our study in Deuteronomy, so I was asked to teach a series of classes on the subject of the church. So that's what we're going to start looking at this morning, and we're going to do that for a couple months or so, and we'll resume with Joshua when I get back from India sometime in December. But as far as the study of the church goes, I thought I'd open up by just kind of trying to figure out where we're all at in our understanding. And I want to do that with a little game of word association. So I write the word church up here. And when I say the word church, what pops into your head? Just kind of shout out answers. I'm going to write them up here. We're going to figure out where we're at. Assembly. Assembly, very good. What else? God's people. All right. I did not hear that one.
Called out, she said.
Ah, called out. All right. Anything else?
Gathering.
Gathering. Okay. The internet. The internet? What?
That's my stupid computer.
Well, I made a promise to myself that I was going to completely ignore the most idiotic. I was going to put up, even if I thought the suggestion was totally idiotic, I'd put it up here, but I'm going to ignore that one. Anything else? Body. Okay. All right. Let's say body. Singing. Singing. Anything else? Nothing? Are we? Kingdom. Okay, now, all right, we're getting into some of the descriptions. Good. The bride of Christ. I'm just going to write bride because I don't feel like writing out a bunch of things. Seems like we have some good ideas up here. I want to talk about some of these. If anybody has any more, just shout them out. But the main thing I think we're looking at, it looks like we've got some good ideas up here. That the church is the assembly or the gathering. Somebody said God's people, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me ask you something. Is
family?
Family? Okay, family is good. All right. Here's the question for you. Now, is the word church, is it an inherently religious word? No, it's not.
I disagree.
You disagree? Oh, good. We got disagreement.
The English church is an inherently religious term, but the term in the Greek in the Bible that is used, that is translated by that word, is not.
Right. Yeah, that's also correct. The word church is, in our society, in our language, and in our nomenclature, an inherently religious word. But the word that it is translating in the Greek, which I'll put up here, which ecclesia is what that says, and that word is not an inherently religious word. The word simply meant group or assembly. And in fact, it is used in secular Greek literature quite a bit. I have some quotes here that maybe I'll read for you. Here's something from Thucydides. The Athenians, having heard both sides, held a second ecclesia, and although at the earlier one they were rather inclined to agree with the words of the Corinthians, on the second day they changed their mind. Now what does that sound like the ecclesia is there? An assembly. It sounds almost like a town hall meeting, doesn't it? Yeah. Another one. Whereupon the Athenians called an ecclesia and gave their citizens an opportunity to express their opinions, and it was resolved to consider the whole question and then give their answer once and for all. So there again, you have that same idea. From Volume 2, Pericles, however, seeing them exasperated at the present moment and that their intentions were not for the best, and convinced that his judgment was right about refusing to go out, would not convoke a meeting of the ecclesia, or any gathering whatever, for fear that if they got together there would be an outbreak of passion. So here he doesn't want to call an ecclesia because he's afraid there's going to be a big fight on their hands. And on, there's quote after quote from Josephus and Plutarch and Isocrates. Here's the thing we kind of want to ask ourselves, okay, at what point did we get from that, which is not an inherently religious word, to this, which is? And is that a good thing or not? Oh, you want to, well, let's blame it on the Catholics, right? I think that ultimately, yes, we are owed this idea to what I would call an institutional view of the church. This idea that there is some kind of religious construct that exists apart from the Christians that comprise it. But is this idea limited to Catholicism?
No.
No. You can find...
You ask the average denominationalist, and he's going to give you an institutional definition of church.
Okay. What if you walked into your average local Church of Christ, like this one, and asked somebody?
You might get a mixed bag.
You might get a mixed bag. Okay. Which means that there might be some Christians, people that we would call brothers and sisters, who have a similarly wrong-headed institutional view of the church. Maybe none of you have that. Maybe some of you do. I don't know. But I'm not going to try to pass judgment or anything like that. But it's the goal of this class to unlearn any bad ideas that any of us might have and to relearn what the Bible has to say about the matter. Dennis.
Could you define what you mean by
institution?
Because we all have an idea.
Very good.
That's what you mean.
I debated having another game of word association up here where I asked, what do people think of when they think of the word institutional? What do you think of? Mark knows the answer because he and I talk about this all the time. But Asylum. Okay, there you go. Who wants to live in an institution, right? When people hear, among our brethren, sometimes people hear the word institution and they get this idea, we're talking about social gospel issues, or whether or not we can give money to orphan homes out of our treasury, or whether or not we can give money to schools out of our treasury, and issues, basically what we can do with our money is what most people think of when they think of institutionalism. But I think it goes beyond that. Institutionalism doesn't just stop at there are people that have a very strict conservative view of what we do with our treasury and still have what I would call an institutional view of the church. And I better scroll through this because this was later in my notes. But
maybe you better delineate that by saying view the church as an institution. Institutional view, because that may be a little confusing. I've struggled with that for a long time.
Yes. Well, I think... Here it is. Yeah, according to Webster, institutionalism is an emphasis on organization, as in religion, at the expense of other factors. And the major issue of stake here is ultimately, how do we, as human beings, relate to God? Do we relate to Him as individual Christians? Do we have a relationship with God, when we walk out those doors, when we go out in other places? Or do we need the church to have that relationship in the first place? That's something to think about. Mark.
Catholics, and I have the actual quote from Catholics of what they consider the church to be, but in layman's terms, the church is an institution into which God has placed all of the blessings that He has for mankind, and to receive those blessings, basically the 7 sacraments, marriage being one of them, the Lord's Supper being one of them, and so forth, you have to come to the church and receive them from the church. Salvation comes from the church. So to get salvation, you've got to go to the church to receive that. Mm-hmm. And so Mark Morris Air Conditioning is an institution. We signed some documents and we filled out some paperwork with the state, and we formed this empty box called Mark Morris Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Inc. Now, that is the corporate institutionalism that actually the Catholic Church believes. The church is an empty box. Into that box you put the sacerdotal priesthood and all of the blessings God has for mankind. And now the people are not the church. The church administers to the people.
Right, and therein is this idea that this ecclesia up here, this congregation, is somehow an entity separate from the people that comprises it. Now, you're kind of scratching your heads and going, what does all of this mean? I think there are some issues that are symptomatic of this view, and perhaps one, which has been my real pet peeve, my real shtick lately, is this distinction between the local and the universal church. Because we recognize that distinction in principle, or we will pay lip service to it. But sometimes our vocabulary, and this is true, even me, I have to catch myself sometimes doing this, but sometimes even our vocabulary betrays that we've really kind of conflated the two together in some way. And so here's the real question we have to ask ourselves. What makes up the universal church? Is it made up of a bunch of different local churches? Or is it made up just simply of Christians? Well, what's the answer to that? What is the universal church made out of? Christians. It is not made up of local congregations. The local church is not a subset of the universal. It's a model, we might say. It has some typological connections, and there are things we can learn about one by looking at the other. But do not get into your heads the idea that here's God's universal group, and here's all these local groups that are attached to it, and that are when you put them all together, you get the universal group. Now sometimes people will take this set of local churches and put them over here, and take this set of local churches and put them over here, and take this set of local churches and put them over here, but they're still all part of the universal group. What do we call that? We call those denominations. This group of local churches over here is the Anglican churches, and this group of local churches is the Presbyterian churches, and so on. Now, some denominations, they don't want to call themselves a denomination. They don't want to acknowledge that there's other groups of local churches in the mix. For example, Catholicism wants to say that, we are the one true church, and all of our local churches equal this big thing up here, right? Sometimes a cult will do that, like the Jehovah's Witness or the Mormons. We are, this one group, everybody else is apostate, and we're alone are the universal church. And I dare say some of our brethren do just that, don't they? You slap a name on it, you group a bunch of local churches under it, what have you got? You've got a denomination. And if you claim you're the only one that exists, well, you just called yourself the one true denomination. And so, there's this vehement denial among groups that call themselves churches of Christ that no, we are not a denomination. But why are we using we? Why are we? What exactly is this we that we're talking about? What is this group? And so that, I think, is another idea that does need to get deconstructed. Because as soon as you name it, you've denominated it. In fact, the word denomination comes from the same word family in English as our word for name, or nominate, or other things like that. So that too is an idea that needs to be broken and deconstructed in our minds. Now, it may be that there's some kind of hierarchical structure, some kind of denominational construct that exists over everything. I want no part in that. I think that simply this group here that meets at 14th Avenue that belongs to Jesus Christ ought to strive to be just that. A group that belongs to Jesus Christ. Strives to do His will. We're not going to participate in this denominational hierarchical structure. We're not going to pretend that there aren't any other local churches in the world. And we aren't going to pretend that we're the only Christians because, what does that mean? Well, you can't be the only Christians because somebody out there might have picked up their Bible and started doing what it says. I see a hand. They called themselves a lot of things. The disciples of Christ, they're in Romans 16:16, they call themselves churches of Christ. They call themselves the followers of the way in Acts. I forget which passage in Acts says that, but and on and on. And some of these terms up here even are terms that are used of that group. So there isn't, in the Bible, there is not a specific name that God gives to His people and says, this is the name you must use. And if you're saying that there is a specific name that you must use, you're actually binding where the Bible is not bound. They were called Christians first. At Antioch was the first time they were called Christians. Acts chapter 11 in verse 26, I believe. I'm sorry? Well, yeah. Okay, yeah. So Christians is another name used for the group. You know what else is used is saints. We don't, you think about that. In modern religious vernacular, saints, comes to mean some person that's died and been venerated by the Catholic Church. But that's not what a saint is in the Bible. All the saints that are talked about in the Bible are alive. Well, except the ones that have been beheaded. But I mean, a saint is just a holy one. It's just a person that's been sanctified by God. And so if we go and, count the number of different terms that are used for God's people, disciples is pretty frequent, saints is pretty frequent, Christians is in there, but it's only used 3 times in the New Testament. It doesn't, well, I'm not saying that it's not a valid term. I'm just saying it's not the only term that we're supposed to be using. And that's the idea that we need to get our heads around. There is not a specific name that has been demanded of the people of God to the exclusion of all others. That's the point that we need to get across in our minds. Now, I realize this has been kind of disconnected and I've deviated way from my outline already. But I'm going to stop here and ask, are there any comments or questions that need to be made before we move on? Well, I'm curious. No, if you got some, I'm all ears, Well, I mean, we'll come back to the naming concept in a moment, but Don.
I got something that's just a little long.
Sure.
Catholic verb is what prevails in our society.
The word saint comes from our word sanctify. It just means holy one. And in fact, that same connection exists in Greek. The hagios ones, the holy ones. It's just another catch-all term for Christians or God's people. Mark.
I think just by way of clarification, since you and I have talked about this quite a bit, as far as the name we hang on the shingle out there goes,
okay.
You're not. I've often thought. Let me put it this way. I've often thought that putting Assembly of Christ would be a more correct term according to today's definition that most people see when they see the word church. They do not think of the same thing that the Bible thinks of when the Bible says the word church. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps Assembly of Christ might be a better descriptive term to describe to them what we are. I have seen some congregations that simply put on their sign, Christians meet here. Mm-hmm. We could put saints meet here. Mm-hmm. But then I've had some of my brethren that get all upset because, it's important to say Church of Christ. And that's really not emphasized in the New Testament, that's the term we have to hang on our shingle.
Well, my question for those who demand that be the name on the sign, where's the scripture? Where's the passage that says it? Keith?
It says it exclusively.
Keith?
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. However, Christ will call the church. It's not society that dictates to us or to the scriptures. It's our responsibility to teach. There are a lot of different understandings, and that's why we don't come, that's why there are denominations. We're separated in this religious world because people are reading different things. They're following the tenets of whatever it is they're reading. If we're not reading the same thing, we're not understanding the same thing. Yet we want to put it all under the same umbrella, and it doesn't work that way. Our responsibility is to teach the truth concerning any issue, including this thing called the church. It's used in the scriptures. Why can't we use it?
Well, and
Responsibility to understand what it means.
the question we're asking is the word church, is that even an appropriate translation of ecclesia in the first place? Now, I would contend that no, it is not, because it is a word that is the product of a very ecclesiastical, institutional mindset. I mean, you know,
Well, you just said, you just gave an example of the ecclesia being a community meeting.
yeah.
Yes.
Ecclesia?
Yes.
Well, that's what I just said.
Well, yeah. Ecclesia is right now.
Okay. Well,
A gang of thugs could be an ecclesia.
okay.
That's why you identify it with
So here's, I mean, you know, the question is, do we want to be taking words that do we want to be translating words from Greek into English with things that are not their equivalents? Well, to me, that's just bad translating is what that
Replace
is.
it with what?
To replace it with its appropriate meaning. Congregation, assembly, group. You know, that to me seems to be, it's like the word baptize. The word baptize just means immerse. But they translate it baptize so that they could introduce ambiguity into it and so that they could justify the practice of sprinkling. Well, they shouldn't have translated it that way. We should be saying immerse and not baptize. And so I think we have the same kind of confusion going on with the word church. We should just be saying assembly. Now, for the purposes of this class, I'm going to use church, assembly, congregation. I'm going to use them interchangeably so that we can at least somewhat embed that idea in our heads. But, you know, this is something I have a real pet peeve about, I guess, for translators. Okay, I don't know who I saw first, Mark or Luis.
The one thing I want to call, I'm in a strange place. I want to go to worship. I go to work for that's simple. Don't know whether Christians meet here. You know what
I'm not going to object to the idea of finding... I'm not going to object to the idea of finding like-minded individuals who want to read the Bible and do what it says. I think we ought to, you know, strive to do just that. You know, but... Well, okay. Sorry, Mark, I'll get to you in a minute. Keith.
Saints. I don't know if this lady was according to the scriptures or she understood it as she had been taught. Now, a lot of people in the world of denomination will say they're Christians as well. They're this two-headed monster. They're the Baptists and this Christian. Well, how did you become a Baptist? What did you do? They don't know what they did. Because a person claims to be a saint and worships in a way that's foreign to the scripture. Part of this universal.
You know who's in the universal church? Whoever God says is. Now, the only information that I have about who God says is in the universal church is in this book. Right. And, I mean, that's it. Now, it is not my job to decide who is and is not saved. It is not my job to decide anything like that. It is my job to try to do what God has said in this book and to teach what God has said in this book. And, you know, if God on Judgment Day decides to be a little more merciful than I would be, well, no, all power to Him. But I'm not going to, it is not my job to dictate what God has said about who will be saved. We cannot know every single person. We cannot make a list, if you will, of every single person that's in the universal church. It's not possible.
No, we can't.
No.
We can't know whether or not we're saved. You do.
Okay. Now, Mark's had his hand up for a while, so I'm going to let him say his bit.
All right, in Acts chapter 19, 3 different times the word ecclesia is used to describe an assembly that was unruly, and the city clerk actually said, we may have the Roman government down on our heads because of this church. Same word that's translated church. The word is also used interchangeably there with the word demos, which is the people assembled. Paul wanted to go into the demos, and the disciples prevented him from going into the ecclesia. And so the terms are used interchangeably there, demos and ecclesia, for the assembly there, and it's translated assembly.
Right.
Now, the word assembly or word ecclesia is not consistently translated in the New Testament the way I think it should be. The way my never to be humble opinion says it should be. Okay? That does not mean that I am saying, and I don't think you're saying here, that Church of Christ is an improper term to put on our shingle out front.
I'm not saying that at all.
Just that when we do it, and Keith has an excellent point here, we've got to teach. And I don't think for many, many years, at least, for my lifetime, we have done an effective job of teaching people what we mean when we say the word church. And we say the word, come to church with me, people think, oh, it's that building there, it's that institutional organization that you go to that calls itself the Church of Christ. Well, what's different from that in the Baptist church and the Catholic church? And we don't do an effective job of telling people what we mean when we say the word church. That's really the point that I think you're making.
Well, no,
we've got to properly differentiate that.
No, you're right. And I think that that's the most important thing. We use the expression go to church, and I've heard people beat on that. But, I mean, really, if all you mean is go to assembly, then even there's a technical sense in which, yes, that's correct. You all came to assembly this morning. So there you go.
We also, in modernity, we have words that suit the vernacular, the word bad. I said, boy, that's a nice car. I said, bad, what does that mean? A bad, two different meanings for the same word. That's what Mark's talking about. It's our responsibility to study, to show ourselves approved.
This actually proves your point, but for you. But the word "bad" doesn't mean that anymore, so it's already changed its meaning back. I was talking to a friend of mine who he had written a paper. He was talking about how words constantly fluctuate in meaning, and how the words "cool," "bad," and all these other words had meant something that was good. He says, and it's really hard to use these words, and He said, because if you're out of date just slightly on it, you look like a poser. And then in his footnote he writes, or whatever they're saying now. So, I mean, that's... Okay, we're going to talk about that, yes. That's the next pet peeve I have, the word church. Where do we get that idea that it means the called out? Anybody know where that comes from? My preacher told it to me.
Ecclesia is from my understanding. Here I am. It's very dangerous because I know a little Greek, and that's enough to be very dangerous. It's supposedly from two Greek words, ek and kaleo, one meaning called and the other out of.
Okay. All right. So do words mean the sum of their parts?
Not always.
No? Okay. All right. Is this a place where vehicles go swimming? I mean,
Well,
is that a levitating stick of churned milk? No, I mean, it's a, and on we could go. Aftermath, what you do after you're done with your calculus. I mean, it's on and on, this idea, what words do not equal the sum of their parts. That's not true in English, that's not true in Spanish, that's not true in Greek, that's not true in any language ever. Words do not equal the sum of their parts. And what you just said, yes, is one of the ideas that's put forth to say that it means ekkaleo, ecclesia. It's possible, but again, highly unlikely, I think, because the New Testament never actually draws that connection. The basis for this is some people say, well, the word used to mean called out, etymology. And so this has given us some kind of special divine insight into what God means when He says the word church. The etymology is called out. Or etymology being the history of a word, a word's meaning. Now, we've just talked about how words change their meaning, quite a bit. Like the word bad or the word poser. You know what the word nice used to mean? The word nice in Latin used to mean stupid. So you tell somebody that they're a nice person, are you insulting them? No, because the word has changed its meaning. It no longer means that. Keith?
Now, what language was the Old Testament?
Old Testament's in Hebrew,
And the New Testament?
and the New Testament's in Greek.
What Koine?
Yeah, Koine, Greek.
Koine is a dead language.
You are correct.
I've always been taught the reason that it's not, so that the language as it's understood during the time it was written would remain the same. Contemporary Greek, which is different from Koine.
Well, I mean, there's several different forms of Greek even around the ancient times. And I think it's a little more complex than that. You have your Attic or classical Greek. You have your Koine Greek, which is more the language of the common people. But then you also have to keep in mind that, a word could have meant... Greek as a language has several hundred years of meaning even leading up to the New Testament. So even if the word ecclesia meant called out, it could have meant that 200 years prior to Christ. But there's no indication that I can see in the New Testament that it actually means that in the first century. Now, you go on top of that, what did the word originally mean? Well, the original etymology is not just a called out people, it's a called out group of male landowners who got together to decide things by voting. Now, does that give us some divine insight into the organization of the church? I know some people that would be rather uproared about the idea of deciding things by voting as a congregation. That's the etymology. So the word ecclesia, does it mean what it's been invested with terminology-wise? Mark?
Well, when we look at the term as used in the New Testament Scriptures in its context, and Acts 19 is a very good place to look for that. We look at the word demos, or demos, however you pronounce that.
I have to look at how it's spelled.
English it's D-E-M-O-S.
Okay, well,
Greek, but the translation, according to the Greek English dictionaries that I have looked up, basically it's the assembly.
Yeah.
Is what it is. The people who are assembled, or the assembly. Now, ecclesia is also used in context there, the exact same way, talking about the assembly.
Right.
The people who are gathered together in that place. When
Okay.
we look at the term as it is used to talk about God's people throughout the New Testament, and we look in the context of those statements, we see the same meaning being used. The people who are gathered together in one place is a local assembly or local church, if you will.
Here's another question. Does this word appear in the Old Testament?
It'd be the Hebrew equivalent.
Well, we already said the Old Testament.
Talk about the Septuagint or the...
Well, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, but the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, or Septuagint, however you say it, is that word used there? Answer is yes. It's about 100 and something times. What?
All we have are the references. All we have. That's all we have.
Mm-hmm.
We're not versed in languages.
Right.
That's all we have. So we have to trust what we study. And come to the conclusion based on the facts. We can safely what a passage is teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Could this ecclesia, in the two different ways that it's described, have something to do with the purpose? Is it an assembly for the same purpose or for one purpose? Could that be added to the understanding of it?
I'm trying to understand your question a little bit. Does the assembly have...
Maybe the purpose of the assembly is relevant to our understanding of this definition.
Well, almost every
Common purpose.
almost every assembly has a purpose for existence. Seems inherent in the meaning. I'll read some of the entries from the Bauer, Dunker, Ardent, Gingrich, which is considered the kind of the standard for lexicons. It is a regularly summoned legislative body or assembly, a casual gathering of people, that's definition 2, a people with a shared belief, community, or congregation, number 3, and, just addendum to that, it can be used of the Old Testament Israelite assembly or congregation. It can be used of Christians in a specific place or area, like this congregation here, or it can be used of the global community of Christians altogether, the universal church. And, quote, the term apparently became popular among Christians in Greek-speaking areas for chiefly 2 reasons. To affirm continuity with Israel through use of a term found in Greek translations of the Hebrew Scriptures, and to allay any suspicion, especially in political circles, that Christians were a disorderly group. So that's the idea that's been put forth here. Is
Many of those definitions
are everything we just talked about. Yeah. Well, I think our basic idea, we need to understand it as the assembly, God's people. I'm not fond of called out because there's no evidence for it in the New Testament again, but I'm not going to belabor that point too heavily.
Do you want to comment on part of an assembly which worships foreign to what the Scriptures describe, yet they call themselves saints?
We're out of time, so we'll save that for another class. We'll have some more to say about these things as we go. I do want to talk about some more of these different ideas. It was a good discussion. We'll pick up next time and we'll hopefully talk about some more of these distinctions we need to draw.